Question.
Questions?
Oh, okay.
So
Nothing
today,
personal.
yeah. Okay, this is Mafugwe podcast. We are about real exile stories. We are about Africanism. We are about Pan Africanism, as they call it. They call it that, right? Yes. Then we have in that day, Tswagare Namane. It's a Tswana name, so too many Tswatswas there. But today we are all about literature. Literature in the only literature in Xhosa for it. Literature in Xhosa. Is there like a word that let's start there? Is there like a word that represents?
inzima ukuyichaza nkosi yabo
Intoni?
inzima ukuyichaza
Or inzima uyichaza. Tata Namane.
Maybe people Gwadi or
Yeah, Bukwadi.
something like
Right.
that.
Sort of yeah.
Writing.
It has to do with that. All right. Today's episode is about that. It's about literature. We have that Tswagare Namane is a writer. He's an author. He has about 3 books already. Three out.
Actually, 4 books and 5 actually, and then the other one is a book that I edited
Okay.
but I've edited other writers also
Okay.
who have published.
All right.
So I have at least done considerable amount of work in writing.
In writing.
And playing various parts.
Okay.
There's a book also that I've produced, a name which is not usual for books, but we took this manuscript and did the whole process of publishing it.
Okay.
Without claiming anything. It's a project that we did gratis. Yeah.
I think with the future, you believe not too much in digital. Will we have some of your books digitally?
Yeah, some of my books are already there. I mean, I think these books, except for the novel, the poetry books are mostly available also digital. Yeah.
So most
In
of
fact,
the books,
I published them first as e-books, and then I did the print version.
you did the print version.
Yeah.
Because print version are always better. I believe in that. I'll die believing in the print than this
Yeah,
technological
but
thing.
the thing is that in other countries, the e-book is already in. They're using that Kindle thing,
Yeah.
to read books. So even schools, they get rid of prints. This is why they're donating books all around the world.
They don't understand the importance of the importance of print. I think so. We might one day have a topic about it. Print versus
Digital.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah, it all depends really. I think that in society there are certain classes that are basically attached to the form of things. Like, let's take the case of a vinyl versus a CD. There are
Vinyl
people who are
CD.
just in love with the vinyl. Just for probably
I'm-
for
I'm one of
aesthetic
them.
purposes.
For sound.
Mm.
The sound before he plays, before the song comes in. There's that sound that it makes. I loved it. The quality of it too. I mean, I think it's more original than the disc. But I'm okay. I'll give the disc it's 5 out of 10. But with an LP, what wahan. That is much better. I give 11 out of 10. That the mind.
Yeah, but
Right.
let me just add also that digital has made things easier in publishing. Print was much more controlled by, especially the elites.
The elites.
If you didn't come from there, you're not going to publish. You had to come, according to their own dictates. So with digital, more and more people have access to publishing. In fact, now you can even publish yourself. You don't even need a publisher to publish a book.
You can do it yourself from the comfort of
From
your own home.
yeah.
Nice. No. Now with today we are about literature, right? As we start the tournament, for somebody who doesn't know, What is literature for somebody who just doesn't understand the word literature, what it means? And in the same question, do we have different types of literature? Do we have what we call African literature and the rest of the world literature? Do we have something like that?
Well, literature comes out of the, the practice of writing. And this becomes only possible within certain societies, certain levels of civilization, because it presupposes that there are people who are dedicated just to doing that work. Those people have to be trained. They have to be away from normal day-to-day production. In a society where balema, they can't have literature. Usually those are smaller, communities, and word of mouth is enough, to keep knowledge of that society. But literature becomes a necessity once you have bigger settlements of people, once you have what you could call empires, because now you can't speak to everybody, messages have to travel distances. Sometimes, look at today, we are watching what Trump is saying every day, because America is basically involved in our lives, even as far as we are. So literature becomes important there because it's a form of communication, an evolution of coming out of orality. You speak, it's enough to speak, you get the message, But with literature now you can talk to somebody who's far from you. So literature you could say it's a symbolized way of communication. You use symbols in order to rather than word of mouth directly. So there are, of course, with evolution of societies, then you have different types of literatures, and this is according to the needs of whatever. It's not only literature as art. I think as art is something that comes later, probably that even presupposes element of ledger, because when you have art, although art initially also itself fed into the development of literature, because the symbols, somebody had to visualize these symbols. The alphabet itself was created out of art, pictorials, what is called ideograms, where you have these pictograms, you have pictures, If you look at the letter A is the head of a car, facing downward. That's an alphabet. So this is where all these letters come from, and they grow with society and the creativity of society. Now they become a language in themselves, so that writing becomes a language. So you have two aspects to language. You have what is called the day-to-day language, as compared to the literary language, which now literary language has to be learned differently. It's not like the oral type of language that you learn, colloquial, what we call colloquial language, which is what you learn at home. You know how to speak, the language that we use at home. The literary language is much more formal and has to be learned, over time. Takes longer to teach, It's not as almost automatic as learning the colloquial language, So out of that you have then, different, you have literature in that sense, but it develops, you have academic writing, which is a form of literature, you have literature as art. Journalism itself is art, it's communication, it's literature, journalism, but it's, so you do have various forms of writing, and those forms of writing, collectively they are called literature. So you could say the science of writing.
Science of writing. So basically, Ake Hopula, as we're growing, uh, Egypt seems to be the beginning of things, or as I could say, that's what we are told. That's what it's said. That is what is put out there. Egypt could be the beginning of everything, the writings and everything. Is it true though? Are they saying that like more okay, the down south never had anything, never had ways to communicate, maybe, or never had ways to leave behind information for the coming generations, maybe.
Yeah, we in answering that we have to understand the dynamics of history. You know how society evolved in Africa. So Egypt itself came out of deeper Africa. You know, it's not like Egypt was there and then suddenly it became something. No, it evolved out of deeper Africa, which is why when we look at our languages, you know, the so-called Bantu languages, they are very much tied to what is written on the hieroglyphs, you know, on the walls in Egypt. You know. The language was pretty much the same. The vocabulary, you know. So language came out of Africa. It's a collective, you know. Egypt became like the zenith, the epic, you know, the high point, you know, of African civilization. You know. But the thing with colonization is that when white people came here, it was in their interest to cut us away from history, and then so that they could turn us into slaves and, you know, whatever they wanted. You see that with slavery in America. That in America, black people were forbidden from learning, from reading, from writing. It was a crime for a black person because it was a threat to the system. The minute you have access to knowledge other than what your master tells you, then you become dangerous. So, how we look at Egypt, Egypt was an African civilization, it was a black civilization, and it came out of Nubia, you know, it came out of deeper Africa. Because, I mean, even in terms of archaeology, humanity starts in East Africa and it evolves out of that. It goes until, you know, people conquer the whole world, you know. So others change somewhere because of climatic conditions and so on. And those who remain behind because of the elements of nature, you know, they get darker, you could say, with time because, you know, they have also to acclimatize. So they have to have more melanin and so on and so on. So writing, basically, I have this young guy that I'm following who specializes in linguistics, a guy called Sandile Kamatikani. So that guy can show you, using African languages, how the letters of the alphabet came out of our languages from Africa. So the Greeks did not develop the science of writing. They just appropriated it. You know. It came out of Africa and it came out of our languages.
Okay. It's really about literature. I just want you to break it down more, or you know, for a timber or a jazz industry. I understand what the importance of this of literature, and with the different times, the then and now, when it comes to literature. You know, it's like how important is this, and taking into the present and the future as well?
Yeah, okay. Let's look at what has happened to us as black people in this country. Our old civilization. It has been completely destroyed. that civilization was based on land. You know, the land was the basis of family, and family was everything in African civilization because that's where the knowledge was. That's where the graves were, the history. You know, the monuments were there. This is why kana going waiting on Zohula, even le mo vacationing. Ono rumelwa hae, ne re bitsa hae, mahaeng kwana. Ho mo na le nkgono. Ha ntse ho hola hore nkgono a tla fihla a o kenye sekolo sa hore o mang, o tswa kae. You know, and that process, of course, on a access to the graves. You are isuwa ntate moholo wa hao, e moholo ke yana a robetseng mo ke mang mang if on a photo. So with the this is not even industrialization. Okay, you could say industrialization of South Africa, but which is more at the behest of European need and agenda. You find that that old basis of African culture, which was left out in the rural areas, has been destroyed. Now we no longer have access to Nkgono ba rona. Or Nkgono ke yana tlileng toropong wa sebetsa. Wa bona? Ha a sana nako ele ya hore no a collect information ela kaofela, you know, ya family, and then a hona hore no a ise baneng. Wa bona? So that's why now more than ever we need writing, you know, in order to get together whatever is left, the knowledge that is out there. And so we put it in books so that children can have access to it. It becomes easier. Instead of somebody go America, okay. Literature has to start from the home, and it has to be about the home, and then the community, and then society. It has to go like that. But the unfortunate thing is that to us, because it came as a colonial project, it was used in order for us to, you know, inculcate outside knowledge, you know, which comes as a colonizing force. Because now we have this fear of these people. We see their greatness, which, you know, and we don't have our own version to counter that, you know. So it's very important, you know, in modern times, literature has become inevitable. It becomes you can't, and also literature then becomes the basis of education. You know, why is it that today we cannot educate our kids up to the level of being professional without in their own languages? It's because we don't have the necessary material in those languages, you know, in book form. So what happens with civilization when the Greeks went to Egypt and conquered Egypt? They went and appropriated all that knowledge and they translated into their own language. You know, it always goes like that. So with us also, we need, if we want to develop our languages, you know, which is going to be impossible to develop all these languages. We have to choose which languages we are going to make literary. There are two things. There's a literary, there's a spoken language. So making one language literary does not mean that you abandon the spoken language. But we don't have the resources to develop all these languages into literary because it involves that. Language becomes an industry. You have translators, you have, you know, all kinds of people, you know, lexicographers, you know, you have institutions, you know, that work with that language, that keep on updating that languages in, you know, concomitant to what is happening at the level of, you know, knowledge making, you know. So it's a very complex thing, and people don't really understand. They think that in order to develop literature, the burden has to be on the writer. No, you can't. As a writer, develop, you know, you can't. It has to be a choice that is made, and that has economical implications in that particular society.
You spoke about literary and spoken. Be- Between the two, which one is more important? They are both important, but which one is more important for what? For the coming generations?
Well, you cannot do away with the spoken language because spoken language is more on the ground. It's everyday usage, you know. And in fact, literature also uses spoken language as a source. You know, literature, the written language, does not create language by itself. It takes from somewhere, and mostly it takes from spoken. You know,
What
it
is
is
there?
it is people on the ground who speak and create words, and those words are adopted at the level, yeah, the literary language, and are accepted as part of, you know, the literary language, you know, or even rejected because there are certain words which come and, you know, they don't stay there. You know, what makes them accepted is the dictionary. You know, if a word is not there in the dictionary, because the dictionary, this is where you have almost like a stock taking of, you know, the diction, the words
All
that
the
are
words.
there in a particular, you know, community or society. You know.
So does this mean that we should maybe every society or every what area should have its own dictionary? Because now we
You could,
especially
you could at that level where even at the level of the spoken language, you could have, you know, but mind you, uh, spoken language comes from practice, from custom. It doesn't come from books. You don't have to be educated. You don't have
for you
to be literary for you to speak the language. You get it from home. You get it from home. So once you have a dictionary, it supposes that then you have to go and read. You know, what about people who don't read? Does it mean that, you know, if we store, you know, and the other thing with spoken language is that it's a fast moving thing. It changes, you know, almost every day.
changes all
Somebody
the
comes
time.
all the time.
Hence, my question was based on the importance of it. Which one is better? Which one is
No, you can't say because spoken language has a role. I think that it is the spoken language is more intimate. You know, it's good for learning initially for the child, for, you know, at that level, you know, at community level. It's more. It's, yeah. It's much more. It's less structured. The problem with the literary language is that it's too formal. You know, you can say things this way, you can't say them. But with spoken language, nobody really corrects you that much. You know, people appreciate your creativity. You know, it teaches you to be versatile. You know.
with
So
time and
both are important.
spaces too.
They play different roles.
Different roles.
Yeah.
Now, the danger your spoken language gave me, because with what you just said now, you spoke about it changing time and time, right, again. So, the danger I think, or does it isn't this one of the dangers maybe, moving away from how to even pronounce or how to say certain words?
Well, let's take our situation as an example, where spoken language comes at the expense in the townships. It doesn't really. This is not really being spoken language, but what is called patois. You know, pidgin. You know, what you speak.
It's done to
So, yeah.
yeah.
If you look at that language, it's not. You can't even say it's language because it has not reached that point. But it does serve the purposes of language in that city. The problem is that it is not deep enough. There are many things that you cannot teach with that language. You can survive. It's a language that you can use to survive. Like those languages, Fanagalo. Fanagalo is a language. It's yeah. You can use it in the mines to communicate, whatever. But there is a serious gap there. There's a lot that you miss if you compare So you compare it with African languages, the original African languages, our ethnic languages. They are much deeper. They have a lot of history in them. They carry history. How sebedisa Setswana re bua ka diane, how sebedisa seane. You are basically, reflecting the history of that language, where that language comes from. Because this is something that maybe was coined even 2,000 years ago by somebody, which is why even in the urban areas you find that we still use the proverbs, which are more rurally based, because our cultures and languages were more land based and agricultural. Motho o tla bua seane ka kgomo, kgomo e tjena le tjena, wa bona. And ha rena dikgomo moo. Kgomo practically ngwana ha so high experience practically.
Kona Tswagare will be
Seane ka Sesotho ke eng?
Tswagare ka Sesotho ke king is the word, not Tsoma, but it's more of what?
Idiom ka English, it's an idiom.
Idioms, yeah, there are idioms in English. Then ka Sesotho tla be le ikela ke man. The word will come. It went. Now with all that said, Namane.
Is it not Maele?
Maele, yeah.
Maele.
The word is Maele. With that said,
Maele, I see the proverb. I see the proverbs.
No, but I think they mean the same thing.
Okay.
Particularly different.
Yeah,
Let's talk about African literature.
Yeah.
But before, we're not talking about bohlokwa ba ditshomo, wa dipula ditshomo.
Yeah.
Ka Setswana tse ditshomo.
Yeah, ke tla le hopola lebitso la teng.
Bohlokwa ba ditshomo ke kona ka kgotsa tema ditshomo ke
Ke bo di-fairy tales.
Mibongi.
Mibongi. Alright. I'm one of those. I was lucky to be in that generation. Yeah, with Rona compared to Babang. Those that never had. There was something as one was growing, we were more more imaginary. Than the ones that are using these technology things. Now you would my dear better home. I think the dim. Yeah, my better the dim. Lara do 15 on our together homo eo. Yeah, my dear better the dim. Each and every one of us will have a different we all have different my dear Petsani and the dim. Because you have your own image of my dear Petsani and your own the next person will have his or her own. So since the high sides are all into these things, what do you think what is the impact of not having that?
Yeah, well, the impact is that we lose the knowledge that was transmitted through those stories. There were some fundamental lessons that were taught through those stories to children, particularly. So these were mostly children's stories. So they were teaching you something. Maybe they were teaching you respect. Like Sona says,
Oh, it's not yeah.
Because if we pull Tselane, I think the mother asked her time before time. But then she violated, and there were implications to that. So there are values that are being transmitted through these stories. So I really, again, much as Kinana or no, we can lose knowledge, But at the same time, knowledge is something that we cannot lose. Because it just recedes. It's just going into, what is the subconscious mind, and it comes back in the form of creativity, as maybe writers, write those stories now, or poets, or people who sing, singers, it comes visions, This is an old knowledge that comes in new forms now. It doesn't come directly. The spirit, as the mother, of that knowledge. So, yeah, in a way, we lose that knowledge in the direct sense. But let us look at, for instance, evolutionary literature from Europe. Where Europe, they used a lot of those fables and children's stories about Snow White, and all those stories, which we used to read but they were just so white, and a lot of things, they were lost to us. We couldn't get because they didn't have the same meaning to us. So, what happens when literature develops in America? They develop the comic. The comic is it's at that level, where you create fantastical, beings there, and those, they become carriers of, So, no cartoon, cartoon on television, they play that role. It's just we are not aware, because I carry on has said it like us, and it did that culture and
Different.
the value studying. So innocently they are watching these, but basically, if you look deep down, you find that there are racial connotations to these things. You'll find that the darker animal, there
Yes.
will be like the villain.
Portrayed as
Yeah,
dangerous.
because who sebediswa ntho tse ba reng ke di-metaphors, this symbolic language. So di tla se di na le impact eo ho rona. It's imperative for rona or how to develop a literature ya rona. It must start from there, so that by the time ngwana a setse a ba exposed to what comes out, identity high is already formed. It becomes dangerous when you use other people's knowledge, without an identity, because as they say, motho a tsebang o sa tsebeng hore o tswa kae, that person will end up everywhere. So it's in that sense that so it's yeah, through research, people can excavate some of those lost stories, and document them, and make them available. Unfortunately, our educational system here hasn't really developed from its colonial background. It hasn't. Still, we are using a lot of, in fact, very little material that comes from us. We are repositories of knowledge that has been created from outside.
Also, when you talk about Zeland Lidim, I remember those books. They didn't have the images, which was the drawings.
Yeah, I love drawing.
But as you're saying, or the storyline will tell you what it is what guy and what it represents.
Yeah.
Right. Zeland Lidim, there's something that we relate to.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, in a impact le Morona, because it was a lesson. Because how stories affect you, it's not in understanding, but it's in being part of your behavioral mechanism. You find yourself doing certain things, but you don't. Ubona ka ene, ubona ka impact ya film, film. Rona re hotse ka film. Down my street, go East Rand, was the Indian section. There was a cinema there. We used to frequent that place. And har lo sheba kana film ne ho bontshwa film tse two, nako e nngwe ho na le bese ne re bitsang, or ne re bitsa special, or ne re bitsa e re bonang pele, and then the real film
Will come out.
Why? So those things, if you look at township kids in those names, they even basically ended up adopting identity ya di-cowboys e leng ba na le mabitso ao wa bona setse ba na le mabitso ao, and le behavior ya bona ba feletsa ba behavior jwale, because those films ne di re teacher, go lwantsha batho ba bang, rivalry. Basically o thola re le hostile towards batho ba bang, re lwana le batho ba re na le mentality ya conquest. They were not really teaching us to be, communities, and so these things that's the importance of because film comes out of literature. This is you first write a film script,
and then it is.
And most of the time, the formative, even before that, because if you look at the evolutionary literature, once you reach the novel, that becomes the basis for film, because now you can tell a complicated story out of writing, which you cannot easily tell orature, because with orature, people will forget where the story started,
And with that said, I was reading a book in Tibet, and I saw it in a film form, right? It's a movie here, and in this. And I saw the movie. I was interested in that. Okay, let me check the movie. Maybe it will give me like you forget you forget some parts.
Yeah.
And then with the movie, they just remind you a bit what the name. And then this is the storyline. Yeah. The whole book or the whole movie. But like I had it one.
No, how not because they rely on different faculties of perceiving, of human perception. So stories, they are more oral. If you're talking oral, or even literature that comes out of that still has that oral, kind of, because it uses the poetic form. Because poetic form originally it has that ability of enhancing remembrance. So you're using rhythm, you're using rhyme, you're using syncopation, you're using all those things. They heighten your ability to remember, which is why we remember certain lines, for almost, that's, as I'm saying, there are things that were said maybe even by the Egyptians, so above, so below, we remember those things, it's because of how they've been designed, how they've been structured. So, yeah, the fables, they have that element of using the poetic form, because it enhances even imagination, and so with film, you use a lot of dialogue there, and I could say also drama, the dramatic form, but film also has evolved, really. Today it has got, it has,
the whole book, that you maybe a book with 500 pages, and make that to fit in less than 2 hours in a movie form.
Yeah.
That means there's
Yeah.
some improvement just as they have.
Yeah.
Now with Africans, now how do we get back to there's been evolution that will keep on being when it comes to Tabaya and their literature. Now, how do we then, as Africans, get back to telling our stories in our own way, even using the modern equipment?
Okay, first of all, we have to preserve what we have. Today we can record, if Mokhono has another story, try and capture that story and preserve it, in the form of a recording. But that can also be translated, into written form. For the sake of the first instance, create the literature for the home. So when children learn, they learn from things that have been written inside the house. Before they learn, what has been taught by somebody or somebody's culture. Those things are accessible, but unfortunately, repassive. You have a system here, colonial education. It is passive. We are recipients rather than creators. But we have a lot that we can contribute ourselves at the level here we are. Or what do you call it? We need to have institutions that are or by tutor the languages that are. Wabona kidula ka mohara mahuane ko Pitori. There's something that I observe, how these people are so, self-reliant in bringing up their children. Ngwana wa lekgowa ha rutwe fela sekolong. Ha tswa sekolong go nwa molata o lo ithuta dance or with a drama, or that's part of his socialization, because ha ilo ithuta ndlamo mo, ha ilo ithuta Scattermere, o lo ithuta bo Shakespeare le ballet dancing ke culture. Those things ka hare ho tsona di na le di values, European values. Those stories, they tell the European story, and this is why it's more about the hero and the vanquished, which is about the conquest mentality, because the Europeans have this conquest mentality. It's ingrained in them. It's there in their art all the time. Somebody must win, and that guy, they don't care how much damage that person has done to other people.
We'll go through all the hardships.
Yeah, the hardships.
And then at the end, he will be the hero.
And a low celebrator will not win.
But
we don't sympathize with all those people who have died. But I can araba question. Okay, fine. Let's preserve what we have. Let's for the purposes of documentation. Let's research more. Collect those stories and record them and document them. Then also use all other forms, of human communication within our culture and beyond, in order to propagate whatever we want to propagate. So the formats thing, I think ngwana o na leng o hotseng ko family ho na le a rich culture of storytelling. When it comes to literature, that child has got advantages to bana ba ba hodileng ba sena. Nna ke hopola ha ke etsa bo Sapina, and these are some things that I realized later. There were these young guys who could tell stories. So not stories about Tselana ke ditla hae, because nna ne ke sa dule le nkgono, and Mwaka was a township woman. She really was not, basically knowledgeable about those things. Anaka utokela film. She came from Alexander. She was, So, there were these young guys who tell us these stories. Who tell us, but in those days, I didn't. It took me many years to figure it out. No, it means these guys were staying, with their grannies. That's why they go. Yeah, because go to a point here, those stories, I would take those stories and tell them in my own way.
In your own way.
I understand.
And
the truth, okay, even if this is so many years later. I mean, I'm talking here more than 50 years later, and but I still remember snippets of those stories. Even the songs, because Neditama So I'm just trying to show you the power of storytelling, that we cannot afford, to
let go.
To let go. We need to keep that form and develop it, and it can still be used even for older people, and telling stories and develop those cultures. But language, the learning how to use a language. Those stories, those fables are important, because they teach you, language facility. Wa bona ntho e? O ithuta ka tsona ho, you know, because as I'm saying, ka mohare ka mole o na le
There's a
poetry,
lot.
you know,
There's a
there are all
lot.
these things, the metaphors, ding. Ha mole a yang khono a le mole a etsang. There's a metaphor there. There's a deeper meaning,
Deeper meaning.
you know,
True.
in that, you know. So we shouldn't really, you know, but that doesn't mean that we cannot then also use other forms, because we cannot afford to isolate ourselves from human history, because human history starts in Africa, you know. So there's no being in the world who's human who has not benefited from African
From
culture.
Africa.
From African, because language starts here, you know, religion starts here, literature starts here, writing starts here in Africa, you know. So we have a claim to everything, you know, but let it not be at the expense of how it is framed there, because that becomes a problem. Because now when they are framed in, you know, conquest terms, then it becomes destructive, because we are not that kind of people. We are a communalistic people. We are a people who live together, who emphasize community. You know, we need to push those stories, especially for our children.
There's a lot. Actually, there's a lot that I'm thinking. Maybe let's take a break, right? We'll come back after Mitsinyana.
Okay,
But there's
no
a lot
problem.
that we need to talk about.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to storytelling, and we just pointing ourselves more. There's a lot in the story itself.
Yeah.
Because every and I always wondered what was there ever in Tselane in a demo somewhere, because when they told the story, was also we used to do that back in primary. We used to do that a lot. I think most people did that. We read story. We were taught how to read through the tourism from the book. And then there will be characters. I'll be a Dimu, Mama will be in Selani, so and so will be. You'll always be that person. You always play that part or that character throughout the year. Once in a while, I don't know. How we can put together Dimu to Hubalawe. And
the funny thing, what's about the funny thing? The word Dimu basically is our word for God. You know, some of these things, you know, when colonial writing starts encroaching into our cultures, there's a lot of distortion there. The word Dimu, which is why we have Mudimu, you know, but Mudimu, Badimu, yes. If you go up, you say Mudimu Batlarkizimu, you know, Temu, Dimu go Egypt. It comes from there. It's our word. Now, somebody had that that mischievousness of saying, no, let's call this guy Dimu, you know.
And giants were called
Madim.
It was Madim. So with what you just said now, it makes sense.
It may well be, or in our culture, I mean, we never even heard that concept, Madimu, because the word Dimu, basically, it's a sacred word. It's our word.
It's a word.
This is what in Ajit Mantuenama, these guys, the Greeks, by as Atum, you know, which was Timu, you know, in Egypt, you know. So it has that sacredness to it. Why is it suddenly it is associated with,
and it's always
bad things and yeah,
it's always something gigantic.
It's a way of controlling us mentality, because, you know, you'll see that happens also with the Bible, where you find that, you know, there are things that they take, and then in writing the Bible in our cultures, and then they distort, you know, certain things, you know. So, but distance are away from, you know, our own cultures,
from ourselves.
and you know, that's the danger of always, you know, receiving things from other people.
Yeah. Look, Badimu, Aramudimu, Badimu. and there was Madimu, right?
Mm.
Always Madimu, Lidimu, but Baba Hulam. Mudimu is God, right? Then Madimu, and Savannah, the creatures, so Hulam,
Yeah,
right?
this was
Then Dimu, obviously, Canada. And then we have Badimu. Badimu, we know them as but Bapila in the like the realm that we're not in now.
Yeah.
You have to die first for you to be part of Badimu or to be in that realm. Now, and a little thing, they're very big people. Killing giants. So
yeah, because
Dimu has something, has a meaning.
one of the words Badimu, the prefix yate, ba, it's a spiritual state, you know,
on its own.
in Egyptian system of divinity. Ba, like ka, this why ka Sotho, you know what I was about no, Motukwa Haman ka is the ka, ka bani, you know, because that is your greater being, you know.
Oh yeah.
That's how we understand you. What is your ka, you know?
Okay.
So ba no Basotho ba man, you know. That ba it's a spiritual state.
Oh, I never thought it that
Yeah.
way. Never thought of it that way.
Structures are the language which is something that now I'm discovering, probably because I have an inquisitive mind. Yeah. So how shall I? Okay, but once I feel something basic, most training, and I can try now well into that. Let's so to the space, kill language one. Rekis bites so to go, you know. Mo sotone re na le lebitso re re monna, you know, monna. How we are go Egypt, the old Egypt. The first manifestation of existence is Nun. It's Nun. The waters of Nun. That's the first, and out of which comes Ra, you know. So Ra ki munna, ki nona, ki ona Nun. It's Nun is the what comes out of the waters of Nun is Ra, ki munna, munona, because Mo is you know a manifestation of something. Check out what word we're using right now. Mudimu, which I thought there black people were very, you know, inventive there in saying God ki mudimu, you know, because they didn't want to say mudimu ki dimu. They didn't want to equate, because the original nearly dimu. Well, but no order no ki mudimu, which your name ki product yeah. Why one to so mununa, and then out of that first is Ra. That's Jana Kibizora. I'm addressed like that. Musutu Ra Kintate is ta is pta. Kinjabaran kipta, the god of ta. How we're Kirara, but for Batwas nan, you know. Kirara. Rara habit, Ra habit, kipta kira. It's the same thing. It's people who, this is why people who for instance, don't have an R like Zulus, they will say Tanda for Rata. It's the same thing.
It is. Even the sounds are the same.
Yeah.
Like how what is this? I think it's Swahili, right? Like I don't get the word Mwana.
Yeah,
Mu'ana, right? Mu'ana in Swahili, which sounds exactly like Mwana, and which is Mwana at the end of the day. And the sounds are the same. Mu'ana, Mwana. That's what this Swahili.
Yeah, those languages, when you connect them with, you know, the old Egyptian thinking. So Mora, Rermora. Why Rermora? Comes out of Ra.
Ra. And Moki
Himut.
was the noon thing
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
explained earlier.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But if you go to the Egyptian language, you tla thola ne ba qadile ka wetsa ne ba beha son or daughter ne ba e beha ka morao. Like you have for the god, let's say Tehuti, ba tla re Thutmose. Mose o tlo bona mose eo ke mosimane, moshimane,
Shimani.
mosetsana ke eo ke mose, Thutmose. Wa ithola re mosha, bapedi ba re moswa, mosha, you know, a relatively new, a youth, ke mosha. You know. But no, we will talk about these things.
We'll talk about okay. Let's
When
take a
that
break.
point,
Yeah, let's take a break. Then we'll talk about the structures, camera.
Yeah.
And there's more. There's more to talk about. We'll even add the other old men there now. I don't so super. Right. We'll be back in a few.
Robert, lele pole.
Stop there. The camera.
All right.
Yeah.